Well, welcome everybody to the second day of the Fromm Conference. Remember that Fromm stands for the forgotten, the rebels, the outcast, and the marginalized. And I hope over the course of the last 2 days, you've had the chance to see some of the ways of knowing and understanding the world from our very different presenters on the topics that we're focused on um, for this conference. Well, now it's my great pleasure to introduce my brilliant colleague and friend, Dr. Stacy Tucker, and her talk, Can We Really Have It All? The Glass Ceiling in Higher Education. And Dr. Stacy Tucker is an associate professor and department chair of sociology with American Public University System. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning and a PhD in sociology from the University of Tennessee. Located in the mountains of Southeast Tennessee, she is married with two daughters, ages 13 and 15. Stacy's emphasis in sociology is political economy, which looks at how political and economic systems intersect, often affecting the resources and rights of those who live in different societies. Her research areas include immigration and the sociology of religion, and it is my great honor to turn over the floor to Dr. Stacy Tucker.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to talk to everyone today about the glass ceiling in higher education. So my emphasis is going to be on gender bias. And I do want to just say from the outset that most research on gender bias overall is on cisgender females. And so this talk does not cover non-binary or trans women, although there were a couple of studies that talked about them, but that's just a note I wanted to make at the beginning. I wanted to say too that my hope for this talk is to give you some factual information about the existence of gender bias in higher education today. And also, I would like to include a little bit of my own experience with gender bias. I understand that in talking about personal experiences can run the risk of confirmation bias, but personal experiences can also give us a better understanding at the micro level how people experience things that occur in society that are at a macro level factually based. So I will include just a couple of experiences in my own life as I give this talk. The first thing I wanted to do was just to define bias and talk a little bit about it. So bias in a dictionary definition is an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal or sometimes unreasoned judgment or prejudice towards a group of people. And we know that bias can be individual and it can be overt. People can hold prejudices and display them, but also biases can be implicit, they can be unconscious. And so implicit bias is the process of associating stereotypes or attitudes towards categories of people without conscious awareness. So this can result in actions and decisions that are at odds with your own conscious beliefs about fairness, equality. You know, when we talk about racism, a lot of times people will say, you know, I'm not racist. I have a blank type of friend, or I don't have any privilege in my life because I'm middle class. So things like that, where we can have biases that are unconscious, but that can display in our attitudes and behaviors. And also, we can see biases in institutions. So this can lead to institutional discrimination where the biases are built into the policies that organizations have. And so the individual employees or actors within these institutions don't have explicit overt bias, but they contribute to the discrimination within the organization because they follow the policies that are, in essence, discriminatory. So hopefully that makes sense. At this point, I did want to just give my first experience with gender bias in this way. In my first attempt at I will call quote unquote professional career. So Dr. Fowler mentioned that I have a master's degree in urban and regional planning. And so my first what I would call professional career was as a planner, a county planner. And so when I graduated with my master's degree, I'll preface by saying I live in a small town. So we have approximately 50,000 people in our area. And so that factors in. But once I graduated with my master's degree, I did some networking to try to find a job in planning. And I knew that I may have to travel outside of my area to find something. But in that networking, I did find that there was an opening for an assistant planner. And I was able to get a hold of the planner, and we talked, and it was a female. And she was about to have a baby. And so she was wanting to hire an assistant planner right away that could step in when she had the baby. And then it was questionable whether or not she was planning to return. And so ultimately, she didn't return. And so I became the planner. But in my interview for the assistant planner, the person that was giving the interview was a male. And one of the first things that he asked me in my interview was I going to have any babies? And I know that's shocking because it's largely illegal to ask that. But it was done in a sort of like small town kind of way, like, hey, are you planning to have any babies? Because the implication was that the current planner was pregnant, having babies. And so was I going to have any babies? Because then this job would have to be replaced again. And he went on to say basically that, men are better employees than women because women have babies. And so then like you have to find somebody to replace them. And like, you never have to do this for males. And so it was an interesting conversation, but eye-opening, really, as a young professional coming out with a lot of great ideas in planning, and then hitting this little bit of a wall. I did get the job, but also part of the job was to present findings and then my recommendations for development in the area. And so I remember my very first meeting with the county commission. I got up to make my presentation, and the chairman of the board said, "Hey, little lady, what do you got to say to us today?" And so that term just like ran up and down my spine. I was really frustrated that I was looked at as just this young little girl having something to say, but not necessarily as a professional with a professional opinion. So anyway, that's not entire education. That was just my first experience, but my very, very first career, professional career, I experienced a gender bias. And ultimately, I left that job after about 3 years. Because of that, the comfort level never got better because it's a more of a male oriented career, with lots of um, relations with developers and builders, and that typically are male. And so there was a good old boys network that I experienced, and I was never comfortable with that. And so ultimately, that's what led me to go back to school for my PhD in sociology. So moving on, I do want to just review the glass ceiling, right? So the concept of the glass ceiling was coined in a groundbreaking study back in the 1980s. Breaking the glass ceiling, can women reach the top of America's largest corporations? And so it was this term that referred to these obstacles that prevent women from reaching top executive positions in business, because the business world, CEOs, CFOs, largely male. And so what this study looked at, what was keeping women from reaching that top. And we know that some women have broken the glass ceiling, but we still have the disparities between male and female leaders in the corporate world. So a couple of factors that were included in this study were the persistent stereotype in the US that women lack the aggressiveness needed for boardroom success, or that, probably women prefer working with other women, so they probably don't want to be leaders in a male-oriented um, uh, career. The other factor was the shortage of mentors for women. And so, they found that there was a lot of networking, right, that needed to occur for women to rise in the area of business. And what they found is that a lot of the networking that would occur for males would be outside of the work environment. So it would be like going golfing or going for a drink after work, things like that. And so it was harder. It is harder still, for women to have those networking opportunities. And this relates very closely also to another groundbreaking famous study in the 1980s, which is Arlie Hochschild's study of the second shift, what she termed the second shift. It's basically how women were and are expected to care for children and the home outside of work hours. So in this study, she looked at how women would work their first shift, which is their jobs, because women were entering the workforce at a much higher pace in the 1980s. And so women would work their full-time load during the day, their first shift, and come home and then be expected to work in unpaid work for the remainder of the day and then on the weekends. So she called it the second shift of how the majority of housework and caring for the children happened for women. And so that affected the ability to network with other people after hours. So I wanted to take this and sort of apply it to higher education. And there have been studies on the glass ceiling in higher education, and then some other terms that have been coined for specifically for higher education, things like the glass obstacle course or the glass cliff. There's also something called the leaky pipeline phenomenon, which is basically the idea that the larger number of female graduates does not necessarily lead to more women in academia and in research centers, because women are more likely to leave their careers than men. And so, what we'll find again is that, we've done well in education, right? So the number of women completing undergraduate degrees and advanced degrees has increased drastically and dramatically, even more so than men. We've passed men in accomplishing those education milestones. But it doesn't equate to women necessarily having those higher positions. So again, in specifically in higher education, there's still this difficulty of women to enter the quote unquote old boys club or good old boys network, particularly in STEM disciplines that also tend to be male oriented. That networking is more difficult. Also, there is a gender gap in recruitment and promotion processes. And so I looked at, okay, so what causes this? What causes this gender gap in recruitment and promotion processes? Is it something about women, right? Is it actual? Or is there discrimination in play? And so there were a couple things that stood out. One being a differential in productivity. So men tend to produce more than women when it comes to indicators that scholarly productivity tend to be measured in. So things like number of publications, number of citations, the types of journals they're published in, those citation indexes, and things like that. So those indicators that tend to be used in higher education, particularly in research universities, are the things that register female researchers having lower productivity. And this, again, can relate back to Hochschild's idea of the second shift. So several studies show that this can be explained as a result of family responsibilities, especially for women with children. So the male counterparts are more likely to produce in journals more. Another factor is women's reluctance to apply for a promotion. And this occurs especially in male dominated occupations. This can have to do with lower self-esteem, higher risk aversion. So if they know that there is already a bias in a male-oriented career, it's a risk to try to promote. And so do we want to risk that? Do we want to potentially face discrimination or not? And also if the discrimination is overt, it can often create a pessimism amongst women in considering a promotion. So that's another factor as well. So there are 4 different things that I wanted to tackle today, and looking at examples of structural bias or institutional discrimination in higher education against women. Those are disparities in faculty numbers overall, disparities in faculty salaries, student evaluations of teaching, and then also disparities in service loads. So I'll talk just a little bit about each one of these specifically. Regarding female faculty numbers, we've seen an increase in female faculty members, but there is a disparity in full-time numbers and in higher rank positions. So I don't know if you can see this this little chart here. This is from the NCES data, and you can see here this from 2022. So the total number of faculty and then male and female, and so you can see that you know, females are right there with males overall. You have still a higher number of male faculty than female faculty, but the real disparity then is, you can see at the rank level. So here there's a much higher number of male professors, full professors, than there are female full professors. And then there's a higher, tends to be a higher number of females at lower ranks, such as assistant professor, instructor, and lecturer, than there are males at those ranks. And this is NCES data is for the US, but this is also an international phenomenon. So women are also underrepresented, even as more women are highly educated. So there have been specific studies in places like Germany, the UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Italy. I read a study, an Italian study, and that looked at this issue, and it found structural gender bias related to promotion, even when controlling for productivity or gender composition of an academic field. So, we talked about the factors that affect promotion, like the productivity issue. And so this particular study wanted to say, well, if women are producing less than men, it might not necessarily be institutional discrimination if they're not being promoted. So they did a quantitative study that looked at the probability of being promoted and controlled for those things, those factors that we already discussed. So the productivity, the number of publications, the number of citations, those things that I mentioned, and also whether or not the field had a stereotypical gender composition, such as STEM fields being more male-oriented and other fields being more female-oriented, such as English and social sciences, that kind of thing. So even controlling for that, this Italian study found structural gender bias. So a less likelihood of promotion for women, even if they had similar productivity, and that males still have a higher probability of promotion in female stereotypical academic fields. All right. So the next one I wanted to mention is female faculty salaries. And so this one also comes from the NCES data. And we find that faculty salaries are higher for males than females overall in higher education. And this looks at institution type, public and private, that kind of thing. And so we find that full-time faculty salaries are higher for males than females at public and private, but not necessarily at nonprofit or not-for-profit. Ooh, that should say but for-profit overall. So there is some progress in for-profit institutions and their salaries. But you will see that the higher ranks, I don't know if you can see these numbers, I had to sort of piece together this chart, but it looks at all faculty and their average salaries, males, females, and then I just included this professor rank, and you can see males, females. And so you can see for all of these across the board, male professors earn more than female professors in all fields and in all types of institutions. Okay, the third factor I wanted to talk about is student course evaluations. In the literature, it's often referred to as student evaluations of teaching, which are abbreviated SETs. And those of us in higher education know that course evaluations are used and relied on for various things, but particularly in selecting recipients of awards, when we do program reviews. Also, it can relate to performance reviews, which in turn affect things like tenure and promotions. And then in turn that affects career and advancement. I noted a couple of things just in case anybody wanted to look at them overall, but Holman, Key, and Kreitzer, they have a page that where they add to research on bias of course evaluations, and they have over 100 sources that discuss bias in course evaluations. The majority of them are academic journal articles. Like I looked at it, it was close to 80. And then there are other some sort of like news or academic blogs or things like that. So over 100 sources. Also here, this is a really interesting sort of interactive chart about gendered language in teaching evaluations. So if you have a chance to visit it, it's just really neat. It's basically a chart that it's based off of the Rate My Professor site, and it allows you to type in like any word related to teaching, and it will show you like the breakdown of male female. So I'm trying to remember, like I typed in I think the word expert and the word knowledgeable, and you can see how there are more uses of those types of words for males than females. But if you type in words like caring, it reverses, right? Like it shows more females than males. So it's just an interesting sort of thing. Not completely academic, but is eye-opening. And so research on gender differences in course evaluations showed that women typically receive overall lower scores, even when the evidence indicates that students learn equally from both female and male instructors. I looked at a study, Mitchell and Martin, that examined course evaluations of two identical online courses, one taught by a man, one taught by a woman. And the male professors received significantly higher scores, even when questions focused on factors that were the same in each course, like course materials, textbooks, and things like that. In a similar study, McNeil, Driscoll, and Hunt, instructors in identical online classes, operated under two different gender identities. So the male facing identity of professor, regardless of their actual gender, was rated higher than the female facing identity, supporting the notion of gender bias. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that research also suggests that students tend to value characteristics in their professors that match gender stereotypes. So women are often evaluated more on personality and appearance. They're more likely to be labeled as teacher rather than professor. They are expected to display feminine interpersonal traits, such as warmth and accessibility. And if women adhere to the gender expectations, they are rated more favorably on course evaluations. So if they, for example, on questions that relate to like responsiveness of faculty, female professors are expected to be more responsive as part of their caring, stereotypical interpersonal relations, whereas questions about knowledge or expertise, men are expected to have that. So the point is that a lot of how students respond are based on their own expectations of gendered stereotypes related to those professors. I noticed that something popped up with Rachel. Did you want to mention it, Jackie, right now, just because I noticed it?
I sure will.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, so Rachel just makes a good point. She says, this makes me wonder whether the findings regarding SAT scores should be adjusted to equalize female instructors with male instructors to somehow offset for the differences.
That's a good point, Rachel. I will touch on that, actually.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I have sort of a slide or two at the end to say kind of like, what can we do? And so I'll bring that up at that point. So thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. I did want to mention that the ASA, which is the American Sociological Association, issued a formal statement regarding course evaluations, stating that, you know, they're weak indicators of teaching effectiveness and of student learning, and found to be biased not only against women, but also people of color. And so this particular statement provides a recommendation of using course evaluations, if at all, as part of a holistic assessment of teaching effectiveness, rather than relying on those as a sole measure of teaching effectiveness. All right, and then the final aspect that I wanted to cover today in regards to gender bias in higher education is the disparities in faculty service. And so studies show that women faculty tend to spend more time on service activities than men, and they tend to perform important yet less institutionally recognized forms of service, like mentoring, committee work, emotional labor, like the time that they spend meeting and talking with students, and organizational climate control. One of the studies I looked at found that dominant institutional policies and practices continue to favor more task-oriented forms of service than relational work. And so Acker's theory of gendered organizations examines how pervasive gender inequities are produced and legitimized through these kinds of institutional policies. The communication patterns, the organizational bodies, social structures, divisions of labor. In a particular study, this is the Hanasono that I mentioned there, found that dominant institutional policies and practices continue to favor those task-oriented service. The participants indicated that their departments, colleges, universities tend to recognize and reward those task-oriented services, things that were more competitively selected. So if it was an important committee that you had to compete to participate in, leadership-oriented types of service, and service that can be quantifiable. More collaborative and supportive activities, again, like mentoring, or even things like writing letters of recommendation, which we know requires time and thought and effort. Things from like recruitment often remain hidden forms of what this particular study calls secret service. The gender disparity in time allocation is largest at, interestingly, at the associate professor rank. Another study, Misra, found that female associate professors spend 1 hour more per week teaching, 2 hours more per week mentoring, and about 5 hours more per week doing service compared with male associate professors. And these particular gender differences have been linked to lower job satisfaction and higher turnover rates or intentions. So that's just something to consider. Gendered organizations, Higher education might be considered more of a gender neutral organization, but studies show that even in gender neutral organizations like higher ed, there are still gendered expectations. And so the idea is that women will provide more caring service, but they will be recognized less for those. And in things like tenure and promotion, there still tends to be an emphasis on research, and less emphasis on service, though both types of action are required of faculty members. And speaking of which, I did want to mention another experience that I had, um, and it's related more to, well, to course evaluations and faculty service. So when I was working on my PhD, I had a teaching associateship, and so I had a intro to sociology course in social justice course that I taught for about 4 years. And of course, as a student instructor, I was sort of low on the totem pole. So I got the times that often students, it was their last choice, right? Like I got the 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or like the 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And so my experience with course evaluations, and my first experiences of teaching were interesting because, I would get dinged for things like, it being early in the morning. Like, why do we have this class so early in the morning? Or why is this class so hot? Or, why is this after lunch? Just random things that affect a student's attitude towards a class that have nothing to do with teaching. But when I applied for my first teaching position, they looked at the course evaluations and made a determination in part based on those course evaluations. So they said, these course evaluations are pretty good, but they're not really spectacular. And so, my thought was, okay, but a lot of this is not related at all to teaching. So ironically, at the time that I applied for that first teaching position, I had 2 colleagues that I graduated in my bachelor's degree with, both male, that also applied for teaching positions at the same institution at the same time that I applied. And a couple of things to note is that neither one of them had any teaching experience. So they didn't have any course evaluations to look at. And so a lot of what they were interviewed on was based on their academic career and on their research. Both of my colleagues got their jobs, and I didn't get that position. Another thing to mention was that I was never asked about my research, not once. And even though I had teaching experience above, and again, it wasn't the same job. They were in different academic career fields, but they were both hired based on their knowledge. Whereas I had both knowledge and experience, but they never asked about my research, and I was never able to tell them about it. So just another interesting experience that that sort of opened my eyes to the idea that gender bias still occurs, and even in institutions of higher learning where we think we know better. I'll just put it that way. So I wanted to just mention a few things about trying to develop a system to support the advancement of women in higher education and just mention 3 studies that have looked at, ways that we can improve. One of the studies used a case study to try and develop ways to improve faculty retention and promotion. And it utilized 3 key groups. So the first one was senior faculty as advocates and allies. So it talked about training senior faculty, particularly white male faculty, to be advocates and allies for female faculty by recognizing and intervening in discriminatory practices. It also talked about department chairs and providing training for department chairs to be equitable and supportive in their departmental climates, to look at family-friendly benefits and how department chairs can support their faculty when they have family-related issues that may hinder some of the things that they would like to do. And then the last thing was promotion and tenure committees to address bias through workshops and simulations, trying to have interactive activities so that people can be made aware of factors that influence promotion and tenure, and to work to make it more equitable. Peterson et al. Talk about modified course evaluations. So I think this touches on what Rachel mentioned, is that there have been some studies on how to modify course evaluations to recognize bias and biased language. One of the things that was used was to include language about bias in course evaluations for students to be able to recognize that there are often gender stereotypes, and to ask students to try to avoid any type of stereotypical ideas in answering the question. So it's kind of like a note at the top to say, hey, keep in mind this. And so that was one of the suggestions that they offered. But also being careful in structuring course evaluations and the questions so that they're not, so that they don't have biased language as well. And then Jeffries L. Talks about comprehensive assessment of contributions. So in higher education, giving real credit for service. So when promotion or tenure are considered, to give a more holistic approach, right? To give valuation to those things that are expected and often required on an equal weight with those types of things that are typically looked at. So that's one thing that she talks about, is more comprehensive assessments of contributions. Let's see. I have a ton of additional sources if anybody would like them. One of them I want to mention is an article from 2015, Insights from the Second Shift for the Next Quarter Century. So Hochschild works with colleagues to look at the second shift now versus the 1980s. She talks about how it's still in existence. So we made progress in more equitable home environments, but we still see women doing more unpaid labor. And so the second shift still exists. And she adds into this the idea of leisure time, and how there used to be like an incredible disparity between the leisure time of men and women. Whereas, men would be able to come home from work and just kind of veg out in front of the TV, whereas women would come home from work and do laundry or cook dinner or things like that. And so there's been some evening out of that, but a lot of it is due to the fact that both have less leisure time, and there's more emphasis on overwork than there is on leisure. So just something to keep in mind. Again, if anybody has a question or would like additional resources, I'd be happy to send it to you, but that's all I have for today.
Stacy, thank you so much for presenting on this. It's a perfect fit to what we're trying to do here at the From Conference to bring attention to issues that we may not always see. So if there are any questions, I'd love to put them forth to Stacy here. Stacy, one of the things that I've noticed in research is that we often credit universities that have a higher level of female professors with being more open to closing the gap. And yet the research that's coming out now is that, in fact, it's those with an overly high number of female professors over and above the national average tend to use female professors as a cost-saving method. So they end up paying them less and giving them less opportunities for promotion. Did you find that in your, and I'm not, by the way, folks, I'm not saying that means that they're less worthy of the position, but that for some reason women are willing to take less and do more in service of their position.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things it talks about is women are less likely to negotiate. And often when they are willing to negotiate, it's looked at negatively because it's seen as aggressive. Whereas if males are, they're more likely to negotiate. And when they do, they're more likely to get more out of it because that's seen as natural. Like that's a trait, a male trait. And so the overly aggressive female is not rewarded with higher pay. They are looked on as overly aggressive. So that's problematic. And then we also tend to take adjunct and part-time work more as well. That doesn't get recognized as much.
Bjorn has an admittedly very broad question here. He says, what can we, for the last 2 minutes, what can we do when the structure of many institutions in the country at large do not support change?
Well, I just think we continue to have conferences and talks and inundate the field with these kinds of studies so that it's out there, and we are also able to reference these types of studies. And I think it helps for men, for white people, people that are cisgender, to speak up and be allies for underrepresented populations or populations that face bias. And so I think that's also really key when their voices are heard at an institutional level. So, yeah.
I have to say that was pretty good. That's such a broad question in a minute. Any other questions? I have one more for you, Stacy. It's kind of a not fully formed question, so bear with me here. So many things in academia are already stacked against women and helpful to protect primarily white cis male professors, right? So including the language. So we all know that academic language is a white cis male oriented language. How do we control, or in your research, have you found any ways to control for that leg up across the university so that there is a more equitable and inclusive environment, which we know, by the way, is better for learning?
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I find that sometimes the effort is not always sustainable, right? So sometimes women have to work harder to be at the status quo, and to introduce the right language, to be seen as, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to use the word negative, but always like the ones that are bringing things to light. And again, it doesn't always help. And I find that it sometimes requires, again, people with privilege to make the concerted effort as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think like introducing right language, or less biased language, I don't know if there's right, requires support from all, at all levels.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stacy, for opening our eyes with research and a great conversation. And I want to thank everybody who joined us for this presentation. We have another one coming up at 2. And then at 3 o'clock, there's our keynote speaker, and you won't want to miss her. And at 4, I think it's 4, we have Anthony Garibay closing the From conference for 2024. Thank you again, Stacy. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's joined us.
Thank you.